Apostle Paul has had some bad press. Misogynist, homophobic, supporter of slavery. Is any of that valid?
Well, to an extent, Paul can seem that way if you look at certain passages in the New Testament. But I think that would be a misrepresentation. Paul is, of course, a part of his culture. And if you look at the full Paul, the entire Paul, you have a number of passages which counterbalance the sorts of things you're mentioning. I think immediately, for example, on the slavery issue, you can tell by looking at all of what Paul said that his heart is not really with slavery at all. But given the cultural context, he can't attack it head on. It's just too much of a given in that context. But you can tell that he's not really in favor of slavery. I think the same thing is true with regards to his stance towards women in the ministry, women in the church. He would like to go further than he can and the culture will allow him. So he's limited by cultural considerations. So that you can make a much more positive portrait of Paul if you give him half a chance, if you look at the entirety of what he has to say. He is really a warm human being with great care for his churches, love for his people. And it's a pity, actually, that so many people have taken Paul and made him seem like a bit of a monster.
And in some ways, he was an innovator and a liberator, wasn't he, in terms of...
Oh, absolutely.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, in following in the steps of Jesus, who broke all the bounds, for example, with regard to women and with regard to other barriers, Samaritans, Gentiles, you name it. Jesus breaks a huge number of cultural barriers down, and Paul, following Jesus, does exactly the same thing.
So he goes out to Gentiles and says, you can be full members of the Messiah's family without becoming Jews. How radical would that have seemed?
That's extremely radical. They could have been maybe around the fringe of things, but to make them a part of give them full membership, to give Gentiles full membership in the community of faith was really a scandalous thing for the Jews, especially if you didn't require them to be proselytes, to be circumcised, and to obey the dietary law and the Sabbath. So that's exactly right.
So was he the real inventor of Christianity? Some people say that he was.
Yes, I know that's a common claim. I don't think he was a real inventor of Christianity at all. You've got plenty of material in the teachings of Jesus, in the Gospels, as the Gospels present it, which indicate high Christology, indicate a number of things that are in continuity with what Paul has to say. And Paul himself would be absolutely chagrined to think that anybody thought that he was the creator of the Christian faith. There are, of course, predecessors to Paul in the Christian faith. I think of A.M. Hunter's great book, Paul and His Predecessors, where Hunter shows that you have a whole bunch of early material prior to Paul, which means that Paul cannot himself have created Christianity. And
what about the doctrine of the atonement, that this Messiah died for sins? Did Paul invent that one?
I don't think so. He makes the most use of it, perhaps. Well, that's probably not quite true because John does as well. But you've got in the synoptic tradition, of course, the famous passages, Mark 10:45, that Jesus came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. You have the great the material in the Last Supper, where Jesus identifies his blood as the blood of the new covenant for the forgiveness of sins, shed for the forgiveness of sins. So you've got the doctrine of atonement already in the teachings of Jesus, unless you just arbitrarily decide you're not going to accept the authenticity of that material. But it's there in the earliest stratum of material that we have, and therefore I would say that Paul doesn't invent that material, he inherits it, and of course it's also earlier, the earlier people before Paul believe in the atonement. I mean, Peter, for example, and so forth.